Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a story today that might surprise you. We're looking at President Harry Truman.
A man from a segregated background.
Exactly. And how he became, honestly, kind of pivotal figure in the early civil rights movement. It's wild, especially given all the stuff he sent over.
It is a fascinating kind of paradox, right? Truman, a product of the Jim Crow South, and yet ends up taking some of the most significant steps toward dismantling that system.
So, okay, it's post-World War II. Think about that. Black soldiers are coming home.
After fighting for freedom abroad.
Yeah. Only to be met with just shocking violence and discrimination. I was reading about Truman's reaction to all this, and his words are, well, powerful.
His response was very visceral, especially to get, like you said, given his background.
Right.
I mean, this is a man who grew up in Missouri, deeply entrenched history of segregation there.
He actually said, and I quote, "My stomach turned over when he heard about black veterans being attacked." And then in another quote, he said that he'd never seen or heard of anything so brutal.
You can really feel that moral outrage.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder what pushed him to take a stand.
I think it was a few things. I mean, obviously, the moral outrage, like you said.
Yeah.
But also, there was a growing awareness of the need for racial justice in the context of the Cold War.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the U.S. was competing with the Soviet Union for global influence.
Yeah.
And the hypocrisy of, racial discrimination at home, it was a major propaganda tool for the Soviets.
That's a great point. So Truman's facing all this pressure, both domestically and internationally.
Exactly.
And he did something really bold. He created the President's Committee on Civil Rights in 1946.
And it wasn't just for show,
Right.
They were tasked with investigating racial discrimination across the country.
And then they published all their findings.
In a landmark report called To Secure These Rights.
So this report, it's full of recommendations. Anti-lynching laws, abolishing the poll tax, desegregating the armed forces, voting rights. I mean, the list goes on.
And a radical list for the time, especially coming from a Democratic president.
Who needed the support of Southern Democrats.
Exactly. I think one of the most significant things in this report was the call for federal anti-lynching legislation. Lynching, is this horrific form of racial terror. And Truman understood that the federal government really needed to step in and make us... No. It was not easy. Yeah. And it certainly wasn't immediate. There was resistance. From within the military, full desegregation took years.
Yeah.
But Truman's commitment, it never wavered. He understood that this was about more than just logistics. This was about fundamental human rights and equality.
That's a great point. He was willing to face down all that opposition, all that pushback, just to push for what he believed in. And it wasn't just the military, right? He also issues Executive Order 9980, focusing on fair employment practices within the federal government.
That's right. And he created a board to oversee it all.
He did.
The Fair Employment Board. And then he goes even further. He establishes the Committee on Government Contract Compliance.
The CGC.
The CGCC. And this committee actually had some power. I mean, they could withhold federal contracts from companies that were practicing discrimination.
So he was using the power of the purse to force change.
Exactly. He knew that a lot of companies relied on government contracts, and he leveraged that to promote fair employment.
That's brilliant. It's incredible how much he was able to accomplish, especially with all that pushback he was facing. But I am curious about something. What about the grassroots activism during this period? Did that play a part in all this?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, Truman deserves credit for his leadership, but we can't forget about all the black activists and organizations that were pushing for change from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
They created the context for Truman's actions.
Mm.
And often, pressured him to move more quickly. APhilipRandolph, for example.
Right, yeah.
He was a prominent labor leader.
Right.
And a civil rights advocate. He actually threatened to organize this massive march on Washington in 1948.
Really?
Yeah, to protest discrimination in the military and defense industries.
Wow, that must have been a lot of pressure on Truman.
It was. Randolph, he was a highly respected figure.
Yeah.
And his call for a march really resonated with black Americans.
Right.
Who, were tired of waiting for equality.
Right.
And Truman, he recognized the potential impact of this, both domestically and internationally. Images of black veterans marching on Washington, demanding their rights. It would have been a PR disaster for the U.S.
Especially during the Cold War.
Especially during the Cold War, exactly.
So Randolph's activism, in a way, forced Truman's hand.
You could definitely say that. I mean,
Mhm.
Truman's decision to desegregate the military, it was influenced by a bunch of factors, right?
Mhm.
His own moral convictions, for sure.
Yeah.
The strategic considerations of the Cold War, for sure.
Yeah.
And that growing pressure from activists like Randolph.
Really highlights how those different forces all kind of come together to create change.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, top-down leadership.
Right.
There was bottom-up pressure, too.
Exactly. And, of course, you can't forget about the NAACP.
Oh, of course. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Right. They are constantly challenging segregation and discrimination in the courts.
Oh, right. They're the ones who brought Brown v. Board of Education to the Supreme Court,
That's right.
which ultimately, led to the desegregation of schools. But that wasn't until 1954, right?
Right. Brown v. Board of Education. A landmark victory, for sure.
Huge.
But it did come after Truman left office.
Okay.
However, his actions definitely laid the groundwork for that decision
Interesting.
by creating a legal and social context
Yeah.
where segregation was increasingly seen as, well, unacceptable.
It's like his actions had this ripple effect
Yeah.
that went even beyond his presidency.
They did. And he also, he empowered other groups,
Oh, really?
like the Congress of Racial Equality.
Right.
They were organizing sit-ins and other forms of, nonviolent direct action
Interesting.
to challenge segregation, mainly in the North.
So even though he faced that resistance from the South,
Yeah.
his actions kind of emboldened activists in other parts of the country.
Precisely. His willingness to actually stand up against segregation,
Mm-hmm.
it really gave legitimacy to the entire civil rights movement
It did.
and inspired activists to, push for more radical change.
We've talked a lot about Truman's executive orders
Yeah.
and the impact they had.
Yeah.
But did he do anything else to promote civil rights,
Yeah.
beyond those really broad actions?
He did. For example, he appointed William H. Hastie as governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Oh, wow.
It was groundbreaking. I mean, this was the first time an African-American had held a position that high
Wow.
in a U.S. territory.
That's amazing. Just imagine the impact that must have had, seeing a Black man in that kind of leadership position.
It was a really powerful symbol of progress
It was.
and, helped challenge those racist assumptions.
that were just so prevalent back then.
Everywhere,
Yeah.
exactly. And it showed Truman's commitment to diversity and inclusion, even when he faced opposition.
And all of this is happening, during a crazy time in American history.
Absolutely.
The Cold War is escalating.
Right.
There's this intense fear of communism.
It was a very complex political landscape that he was navigating,
Yeah.
and his actions on civil rights,
Hmm.
seen as controversial, risky even.
So it's amazing that he was able to, push through so much change,
It is.
even the political climate.
It speaks to his determination and his belief that racial justice wasn't just morally right, but essential for the strength and unity of the country.
We've covered so much here.
We have.
We've seen how Truman took these bold steps to promote civil rights,
Right.
from desegregating the military to, using his appointment power.
To elevate Black Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. But I am curious about something. What about his limitations? Were there areas where he, maybe fell short?
There were. He didn't fully embrace the call for federal anti-lynching legislation, for example.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, he expressed his moral outrage, like we talked about,
Right.
over lynching. But he didn't really put much political capital behind pushing for a law that would have made it a federal crime.
Why do you think that was? I mean, was it just pure political calculation?
Probably a mix of things. He was definitely facing opposition
Some Southern
from
Democrats.
Southern Democrats. And he might have been worried about, jeopardizing other parts of his agenda. It's just a reminder that even the most progressive leaders, they have to make compromises.
Yeah.
And that progress, well, it can be incremental.
So even with all his accomplishments, there were still areas where he could have done more.
I think that's fair to say, yeah. And it's important to acknowledge that.
Right.
I mean, it reminds us that history is complex.
It is.
And that even those who, make big contributions to progress,
yeah.
they aren't perfect.
It also highlights kind of the ongoing nature of the fight for equality.
It does.
Truman's actions, they were a step forward.
A big one.
Yeah, but they didn't solve the problem of racism overnight. It makes you wonder what would happen if he hadn't, taken those steps.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's one that historians still debate.
Right.
Some argue that Truman was kind of a reluctant hero,
Interesting.
pushed into action by political pressure, the Cold War.
Right.
Others believe that, he was genuinely an advocate for civil rights, that he used his power to, advance this cause he really believed in.
So there are a lot of different opinions on his legacy and what motivated him.
There are. For example, you have historians who call themselves traditionalists.
Okay.
They see Truman as like a transformative figure,
Right.
a president who challenged the status quo and really paved the way for progress.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then you have the revisionists,
Okay.
who are a bit more critical, I guess you could say.
Right.
They argue that Truman's actions were often motivated by, political reasons
Okay.
or a desire to contain communism, not necessarily a deep commitment to racial equality.
So, not a simple story.
Not at all. And then you have the legalists,
The legalist.
who
Yeah.
focus on how Truman's policies and executive orders, shaped the courts
Right.
and set the stage for legal victories.
Like Brown v. Board.
Exactly.
So they're looking at the long-term consequences, legally, of his actions.
Exactly. And then finally you have the social historians who really emphasize how Truman's policies interacted with, the grassroots activism of the Civil Rights Movement.
That makes sense.
They'll point out that while Truman's actions were important, they were also a response to, the demands of the activists who were actually on the ground fighting for change.
So each of these perspectives kind of gives us a piece of the puzzle
It's a great way to put it.
to understanding this whole story.
Exactly. It's by looking at all of them that we can get a, more complete picture of Truman's legacy and his impact on the fight for civil rights.
It's clear that, this is a story that goes way beyond just one president.
Absolutely.
It's about these larger historical forces,
Yeah.
the people who are actually fighting for change.
Yeah.
And, this idea of creating a truly just and equal society, which is, a challenge that we're still facing today.
Absolutely. I think the biggest takeaway here is that progress is rarely, a straight line
Right.
or achieved by just one person.
Yeah.
It's a collective effort,
Yeah.
a long and winding road
Definitely.
with, lots of ups and downs along the way. Truman's story, though, I think it reminds us that even when there's a ton of opposition,
Right.
leadership can make a difference.
It can.
But often it's the pressure from, everyday people who are marginalized,
Yeah.
that really pushes things forward.
That's a great point. So what's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with today?
I would say this. The fight for civil rights didn't end with Truman. It didn't end with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It didn't end with any single event, really.
Right.
It's an ongoing process.
It is.
It takes constant work,
Right.
Engagement, a willingness to challenge injustice wherever we see it.
That's a great point.
I think Truman's legacy can inspire us,
To act.
to act.
Yeah.
But it's up to all of us, to keep working toward a more just and equal world.
This deep dive has been, honestly, eye-opening. I feel like I know so much more about Harry Truman
I'm glad to hear that.
and his, complicated role in the early civil rights movement.
I'm glad. And remember, this is just the beginning,
Right.
There's so much more to learn, to explore,
You're right.
so many stories to uncover. So, keep digging, keep learning, and keep questioning.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has kind of sparked your curiosity
I hope so.
and inspired you to keep, learning about this period in American history.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Because, the fight for equality, it's far from over.
That's for sure.
And we all have a role to play
We do.
in creating that more just and equal future.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.